Thank you for registering for today's webinar. Please type in the chat box where you are from, your first name, and please like the video as well. Today's webinar is titled Europe Operations and Maintenance, Concierge Services, and Contract Management Practices. And it is the second in our series of 3 webinars that resulted from our European O&M benchmarking survey. Jake Smithwick, PhD, is the lead author on this trilogy of white papers supported by these webinars. And Jake is currently Associate Professor and Graduate Program Director, Construction and Facilities Engineering with the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. Jake, over to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Laurie, and I appreciate everybody being here today. And with that said, we'll go ahead and get started. So today's agenda, we'll go through the benchmarking process. We'll walk through some of the demographics of our study, talk about what our sample size looks like. We'll go through some of the benchmarks for housekeeping cost and other related practices. We have a new section of the report focused on outsourcing and some of the different practices by country and by different types of facilities. And then I included a brief discussion at the end of how do we have better contract delivery? How do we hire better custodial firms, other service providers? So I want to offer some thoughts about how we can do that more effectively. And again, I just encourage you here that as you go through today's webinar, if you have questions, be sure to drop those into LinkedIn or the chat box, or certainly reach out to us and we'll be glad to provide that information. So when we think about why we did the study, why Europe, one of the strategic goals that IFMA has is to develop benchmarks globally across all regions. The North American report, for example, is well developed. We have a new report in Asia. We have one coming up in India. We're working on a new one right now in Africa. We have Europe, and we'll have other regions throughout the world as well. So the reason why Europe is because we're in support of IFMA's broader goals is to provide benchmarking facility data across the globe. The other thing here to think about too is that benchmarking helps us better understand our facilities and how we can optimize the delivery of our services as a facility professional in delivering a product to our customers that best meets their need for their facility. Our group, Simplar, we are a group of researchers and educators. We're based primarily here in the United States, but we have connections throughout the world. We help organizations be more efficient at whatever services that they might be delivering. And that's a key part of what we do as part of our research team. Okay, let's go ahead and dive into the data. And with that said, we'll jump into describing what our sample looks like and how we actually developed this report. So the methodology for this, we first started, like I mentioned, the North America report as a baseline. The reason why we did that is that the North American report for many years, decades actually, has been kind of the flagship product for this particular area. So we used that as a starting point and then modified and updated the survey and the benchmarks based on unique needs out of Europe and all the other geographic regions as well. We had pilot testing by a group of subject matter experts who provided feedback and insights as to what the survey should look like. It was sent to both IFMA and non-IFMA members, and we had respondents from 8 different countries that you can see that are listed out here: Austria, United Kingdom, Germany, Ireland, Netherlands, Poland, Spain, and Switzerland. In total, we did receive 59 survey responses. So from a benchmarking standpoint, this is a little bit on the lower side in terms of quality and number of respondents they have for us to be able to predict out and understand what's happening. So I would consider that this report is more of a white paper or more of a introductory piece about what we're looking at in terms of benchmarking data. So just as we go through the data, keep in mind that this is more of a pilot study that's focused on what are we seeing and what are some of the lessons learned that we have with this. Now, in terms of the number of sectors, we have, you can see here that we have 3 different major sectors that we look at. Services, so this is like consumer services, banking, products, things like that. That's what falls into services. We have manufacturing, so think of facilities that produce things or make things. And then finally, institutional. Institutional are primarily government facilities, but also educational facilities, so schools, universities, things like that. On the right-hand side, we have how the facility is used. So the institutional sector, that's what type of sector does a building serve, whereas the use is focused on how is the building used. And you can see from our data set that office type buildings are definitely the number one representative sample. We have a couple of manufacturing, assembly is gathering of people, educational facilities, and then other types of facilities as well. In terms of where we have responses, I mentioned we had 8 different countries. Most of our data is from the Netherlands and Poland. We also have various samples from other countries as well, but that's primarily where most of our responses are coming in from. And again, if you do have a question about the data, definitely drop it into the chat box and we'll take a look at that here. Okay, let's jump into the actual cost benchmarks and go through the data here. So all the costs that we're going to be present today are euros per square meter. So cost per square meter, and that's how the data is written. You can certainly adjust and convert to other currencies. We have the data in the report that provides the transaction dates, and you can look those up and convert to your own local currency. So what this shows here is we have a custodial cost or housekeeping cost by different, what I call classification or demographic factors. So for example, the first one we have is how is the housekeeping function performed? Is it in-house, is it contracted out, or some combination thereof? Again, this is a little bit limited data, but you can see here that for in-house, on average, we're looking at €8.53 per square meter. Contracted out is substantially higher at just under 20 euros per square meter. And then combination is about 10 euros less than that. So again, it appears for a variety of reasons that contracting out may have a higher cost with that, but again, there might be other services that provide with that too. Again, a little bit of a limited sample here as well. We also look at how is the cleaning performed. Is it done during normal work hours? So think of your 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. type of hours or some other normal quote unquote hours, or is it done before or after work hours? And as expected, if you have a staff that comes in earlier or later, we would expect a bit of a bump in terms of cost, and we see that as well. We also provide this data by different sectors. So again, services, manufacturing, institutional, and the average cost per square meter for that. And then finally, facility use as well. So this is the benchmarks that we see for cost euros per square meter for different types of classification factors. The report, the full report does have a couple other measures as well based on facility age and some other factors, but this is just a sample of what's provided in that report. The next question, or the next thing we looked at is staffing. That's probably one of the most common questions we get from a benchmarking research standpoint is how many people do we need to have to staff out this particular service, whether it's custodial or housekeeping, maintenance staffing, other types of staffing that might be available in the facility. So on the left-hand side here is we looked at the number of people on average that are supervising the housekeeping contracts. And you can see here that this dark blue is none. So there's no supervisors. They kind of coordinate amongst themselves. One employee is going to be down here. So about half the respondents have one employee supervising, 2 employees at 8%, 3 employees at 17% of our respondents, and 4 or more supervisors is at about 8%. So on average, most organizations, most facilities have about 1 supervisor. Again, this will change by the size of the facility. This data is also provided in the report, but these are some things to think about. We also looked at when folks do contract out to service providers, what types of supplies or materials do they provide? You see that supplies, almost 63% of respondents provide supplies, their contractors do, followed by paper products, equipment, background checks, and different training for their staff. Now, the reason why this is relevant is for 2 reasons. The first one is that if you're looking to compare across different facilities, like with your peers as you talk with them, knowing what the contractor provides can help you adequately or fairly assess what we call apples to apples of, okay, I see that you are providing all these different things. Ours are not providing this, so therefore I would expect a cost differential when I look like that. So that's the first reason. The second reason is that if you are looking to perhaps expand or look at different ideas that might be included, having those benchmarks in terms of what is typically included in the contract can also be useful as you look to seek and expand your best practices. And one thing I just want to briefly talk about is how do we actually use this benchmarking data? And we kind of should have done that up front here, but it might be worth it to have a very brief discussion about what that means. When you think about benchmarking data, the main thing that it should help us do here is to motivate us to do something different about how we run our facilities. So many times what I see is that facility professionals have data. So we have these benchmarking reports, for example. They look at the data, but it doesn't go any further with that. The best way to use benchmarking data as we present in this report and other reports that are available is to look at that data, but then motivate us to do something different. That's the key to benchmarking, is that if we're not improving our facilities, if we're not looking for best practices to do something different, then the value of the benchmarking data is limited. So I encourage you that as you go through your own facilities and as you look at your own data, is to ask yourself, how can we improve the delivery of our services and what are our peers doing in the same sector? The last thing I'll say about this too is that if you've not really collected benchmarking data before, like you just don't have that available at your facility, that's okay. Then in that case, then I would just start somewhere. Start very simply, add up your total size of your building, add up the total cost for concierge services, and calculate a benchmark. If you have nothing, just start very simply, and that's much better than doing nothing. So I know I digressed a bit about what benchmarking is, but the value of benchmarking done correctly can really transform how we operate our facilities and deliver a better product to our customers. Back to our staffing. So the previous slide was management, so our supervision. The next slide is the actual staff performing the housekeeping functions. So in the report, again, this is just a sample of the table that's provided in the actual report. We have the size of the facility in terms of square meters, the number of respondents, and the total number of housekeeping FTEs that we have allocated. So for example, for facilities that are less than 5,000 square meters, there's on average the equivalent of a 0.8 FTE. So what does that mean? Well, an FTE is a full-time equivalent, and the way we calculated that is based on a 40-hour work week. Some respondents provided hours based on 42 hours, which was rare. More likely, they defined full-time equivalent as 38 hours per week, and others, of course, have 40 hours per week for what they define as full-time equivalent. Regardless of how respondents provided those hours, we converted them all to be the same equivalency at 40 hours per week. So what does this mean? Somebody who's a 0.8 FTE, this may be rounded up from 3/4 of full time. So imagine somebody that works, let's just say 30 hours a week. So maybe they work, I don't know, 6 hours a day for 5 days a week. That's their typical schedule. And that's how we get these not exactly full whole numbers in terms of what these FTEs look like. And again, also these are averages. So there might be some with more, there might be some with less, but on average, here's what we're looking at. So this is the number of actual people providing these housekeeping services. This is the number of FTEs for supervision. And then lastly, this is the number of project cleaners or specialized cleaning crew. This particular one on the right-hand side wasn't used very often across different groups, but we'd still ask the question to collect some of that data. This next slide looks at, there we go. This next slide looks at the typical term lengths and contract structures that are provided for those that do outsource the housekeeping function. We have a pretty even distribution. From our respondents, 18% had a contract term length of 1 year or less, 27% at 2 to 3 years, 27 at 4 to 5, and the remainder at 6 to 10 years. So there's almost an equal distribution. Now, the reason why contract terms are so important to us and why we need to think about this is that as a custodial or a housekeeping services provider, they have to look at what is the long-term outlook from this particular contract. So there's two different ways to look at this. The one perspective is that if I limit the length of those contracts, let's say 1 year or less, then as a custodial services provider, I have limited incentive to provide or invest in capital expenditures for this particular contract. So that means not buying new equipment. That means not buying other resources that can make the process more efficient or more effective. On the other side of it, is that if your contract terms are very long, let's say 5, 7, 10 years, then the concern with that then is that we can become complacent. We have a very long-term contract. Our motivation to provide top-notch services are limited because, well, why not? We have 5 more years left before we think about renewing this contract. So my recommendation is to look at peers, identify peers that have similar length of facilities, and look at how they structure their contract terms. In general, what I've seen professionally is that most terms are between 3 to 5 years for these contracts because that gives them, the service provider, enough time to invest in capital expenditures to your contract. And at the same time, it's not too long where we can become complacent in terms of delivering those services. We asked respondents, for those that do have a contract out, what's your plan once that contract comes up for renewal? And you can see here, based on our responses, 50% of the respondents are planning on renewing the contract with the same provider, which is interesting. So folks, if they're satisfied with how things are going, then we'll sign the contract again with the same company and add on another X number of years. So 3 years, just renew it with the same company, not have any real competition. 70% intend to rebid the contract. So they're going to open it up to anybody that wants to propose. They're going to evaluate those proposals and then pick somebody. It could be the same firm. It could be somebody different. So that's what this chart is focusing on here. The next thing we want to focus on here now is the outsourcing of services by country. So you can see here we asked respondents of, and again, I only have 3 shown here. We do have additional different types of facility services, but we asked them, do you do this function in-house? Do you contract it out? Or is it some combination thereof? And this is split up by country. So for example, we have concierge or housekeeping services. The percentage of respondents that do it in-house. So in Austria, for example, 67% of our respondents do it in-house. 33% outsource it or contract it out, and nobody has a combination. We have maintenance, so think of your typical maintenance services within buildings, so roofing, interior work, so walls, painting, different things like that. We have catering, and again, we split these up by country, so Austria, England, Germany, and other countries as well. And then finally, on the right-hand side of this chart, I have the overall metrics that in terms of outsourcing in-house practices. This chart here shows the same data, but it's split up by facility use. So again, concierge, maintenance, catering, but this time it's by assembly, education, industrial, office, other, and then the overall level of practices by the respondents. We provide this type of data, the frequency of outsourcing versus in-house by mail services, customer reception, and workplace relations. So we do have additional data as well, just for the sake of space on the slides. I did not include those, but those are included in the full report. So again, if you do have any questions, be sure to drop that into the chat box here, and we're glad to take a look at that at the end of the webinar or during the webinar based on the types of questions that we see coming in here. So for the last part of today's webinar, I want to talk about how do we deliver or how do we partner when we're looking to hire somebody to provide those services. A lot of folks, a lot of respondents provide or contract out certain services. And the thinking behind this next part of the discussion is to look at how can we do this more effectively if you do contract out services, right? So a couple of questions I'd just like to pose for us as we think about this is, when you think about outsourcing a service, who should know more about performing or delivering the services required? Think about that. Who should know more about how to do the job we're looking for somebody to hire? Because the answer to that question has huge implications in terms of how we approach the contract. And my opinion or my belief is that it's more important for the vendor to know what to do than it is for the client, us as the buyer, to know what the vendor should be doing, right? Let me say that again. It's more important for the contractor to know what to do than it is for the client to know what the vendor should be doing. Now, let's kind of think about that for a second here. If we're hiring somebody to do a service for us, by definition, that means we don't have the skills or the capability to do that internally within our organization. And so therefore, when we look to outsource or hire somebody to do something for us, we want to hire the most qualified expert person to deliver these services for us. And if that's true, then the person we're hiring should know more about how to do the service than we do as a buyer of these services. So what does that mean from a practical standpoint? It means that when we hire expert firms, we have to let them do their job. We have to let them leverage or utilize their expertise to deliver this particular service. Because if we're not doing that, if we're telling them what to do and how to do their job and really slowing down progress, as it were, that can really limit the interest and the ability of the service providers to provide us a quality service. So it's really important that we understand that if we're going to hire somebody to do something for us, that we hire somebody that actually knows what they're doing, but then we let them do what they need to do. Our team has worked on this across a variety of different projects, and we developed this approach or this process called expertise-driven project delivery, or XPD, that focuses on how do we identify or work with people in terms of getting to that contracted point where when we work with people, they can deliver those services. So what does this look like? And we're not going to spend a lot of time on this here, but I just want to kind of present a different idea that as you contract out services, there's, in my view, there's a better way to think about some of these things here. So the way this works is that typically for most facility organizations, we'll start with scoping out what we want to do. Now, this is beyond the scope of today's webinar, but what I have found that most facility professionals struggle mightily with developing their scope of work for a project. I mean, how often do you enjoy sitting down and putting together a scope of work for a new janitorial or custodial contract, right? It's really difficult because you have to write it out. You have to know what needs to be done. You maybe haven't done it for 5, 10 years. And frankly, you don't know everything that should be included within that scope of work, right? It's a challenge. We have other webinars that can talk about that, but it's a major struggle for a lot of facility professionals, right? So anyhow, we put together a scope, then we move to the selection process. Now, the selection process here is when you go through and you pick somebody to deliver the services that you're looking for. So you look at their proposals, you look at their costs, maybe do some interviews, and you identify somebody that we think might be a good fit for your project. After that's done, you identify one firm that you think might be a good fit. And then typically what happens normally is that you identify this firm and you move immediately to contract execution. You get the contract signed, they start delivering services, and that's the end of it. What I want to talk about here, though, is the importance of clarification before getting to that contract signing. So after you identify somebody and before you sign the contract, my strong recommendation is to have what we call this clarification phase, where you sit down with everybody involved in this process to make sure we clearly understand what's going to happen before it does. Now, we've done this several times before on custodial or housekeeping type contracts, where we sit down, we have a clarification phase, and the insights that are revealed, and primarily making sure that we're in alignment in terms of the quality and level of services that are being provided is in alignment with what everybody expected for that particular project, for that contract. That clarification phase is really, really important. Because what we're doing here, instead of just picking a vendor that we think might best meet our needs here, we're picking people based on their plan to do the work, their price in performing that work, and their past performance in having done that, right? So we pick somebody, we bring them forward, we say, hey, this looks like a good firm that might fit into our services. Before we sign the contract in, we're going to clarify about what's going to happen before we sign any contract. That's a really, really important thing, especially for housekeeping type contracts. If you're looking to outsource housekeeping or any other service, but especially for custodial work, that's a really important thing to do. Because we may have a certain level of expectation for how this contract is going to be done, and the vendor expected it to deliver it at a different level. So the clarification phase then allows us to come to an agreement as to how we're actually going to do this. And there's no contract in place yet. So if there's a major gap between what we thought we're going to get and what the vendor's proposing to do, we have the option to walk away and go a different route. Or, for example, if there was a clear part of the scope that was not laid out that the vendor didn't include because it wasn't clear or you forgot to include that, this clarification phase also allows us to make sure we go through and include that as part of the actual contract services. The third thing that this clarification phase does, especially for custodial contracts, is to identify our key performance indicators. Or in other words, how we're going to evaluate how successful this contract is. What measures are going to be looking at? What do the reports look like? Right? So the clarification phase allows us to set all that up here so that once we start the contract from day one, we know how we're going to measure performance and accountability. So in this clarification phase, and we're approaching being wrapped up here, folks, so definitely ask questions if you have them. But in this clarification phase, there's really four major things that we want to think about. The first one is a cost verification. This, what I found, is probably by far the biggest thing in terms of deal breakers, that there are mis expectations in terms of what we're looking to provide, in terms of the cost, the expectations, and how we're going to get that done. So the first thing we're going to do in this clarification phase is have a discussion about here's the cost that's being provided, here's our budgets, here's the scope, and just make sure from a cost for a financial standpoint, we clearly understand what that looks like. This could also entail putting into detail that there's specialized cleanings, that there's special events. If there's extra duty that has to be performed for whatever reason, we can confirm that and clarify that as part of this process. That's the first thing. The second thing is to pre-plan the project in detail. What this especially means is to make sure that at these meetings during this clarification phase is all the key stakeholders are involved in terms of here's what we're concerned about the contract, here's our major offense, here's what the custodial or the housekeeping contractor needs from us as an owner to be successful, and the other way around, right? So pre-plan in detail to make sure we understand what's going to happen once the contract signs, which is related to aligning expectations. We sometimes assumptions, right? We have assumptions about how things are meant to be done. The clarification phase helps get all the assumptions out on the table so we know what everybody is thinking. And finally, the fourth and final major thing of this process is to identify and mitigate all uncontrollable risk. So in other words, what are things that could stop this contract from being successful, and how are we going to go through and identify those major issues? So if there's things that could, the housekeeping company has identified that if this happens, this will limit our ability to deliver a contract. In fact, I worked with an organization where they delivered it was a custodial contract. It was actually in Canada, it was in Alberta, and snow, of course, winter weather is a big part of how they operate, right? So what this company had done, they said in a major snow event, they still had to provide custodial services because people were on site and had to be clean. In the major snow event, and our staff can't get into place, they laid out a whole system of communication for how they would identify different local people that can get to the site to perform their services. And they laid the whole thing out here. See, that's a risk, which is people can't get to the site, but as a services provider, here's our plan to make sure that we can still provide those services in spite of a major snow event, for example, right? And there's lots of examples of what this might entail here. But clarification phase is really important here. The other part of this too to think about, and this ties into benchmarking as well, is that we have to look at metrics. And one interesting thing that with housekeeping, what I have seen, and this is kind of my opinion here, but the thing with housekeeping is that it's really hard to justify or know that the service is being done well. We know when it's not being done well, right? And if the rooms are dirty, if bathrooms are not clean, it's very obvious to us that when things are not done well, we clearly know that. But what about when things are going well? It's much more difficult, especially for a custodial or a housekeeping provider, to explain here's how well things going are. When we do what we're supposed to be done, it's a lot more difficult for us to see what that looks like. So my recommendation is to think about metrics. I kind of mentioned that in that clarification phase. By having these metrics, and that's where benchmarking comes in, can help us have what I call positive accountability. If we're going to have metrics to punish people and have an impact on how they're going to do things, that's not really the best way to use metrics. Positive accountability means that we have data, we have metrics as to how things are going, but we use that to help us deliver services more effectively. It helps us improve as to what we're doing, right? So like I say, how do we improve here? We're not going to talk about this extensively. What does our suppliers recommend? But we do have an article on our website, simpler.com/janitorial. There's a white paper that goes through how do we audit janitorial or housekeeping contracts. There's other recommendations. There's a couple of templates. So be sure to check out the website, simpler.com/janitorial, and there's some resources available for us. So to wrap things up here about how do we have better contracts, how do we tie in benchmarking, I just briefly wanted to walk through a brief case study of what can actually happen when we do this. And this is a case study from the University of Alberta. They had run this XPD process that I walked through on a number of different projects north of $200 million. And their very first project, though, was campus-wide custodial services. So they had gone through the scoping process, the selection process, the clarification phase I had talked about, and then finally delivering the project. So they had used everything we had kind of talked about a few minutes ago. The result of this contract was really quite substantial. The vendor came in, first time they had really seen this, the vendor came in with a lot of new innovative ideas as to how they should deliver the project. In fact, this vendor had a whole set of metrics and tools and resources that they bring to the table, right? It's interesting that again, when you think about how do we engage our partners from the industry more effectively and let them use expertise, the value they can bring to us is really quite substantial. And that's the whole thing with all this. That we want to have better outsourcing practices is identify ways to let the experts use their expertise. And the biggest way we found is just get out of the way as an owner. Let them do what they need to do. So they had a work order management system. They have a tracking system for different buildings and washrooms throughout the campus. They rate overall, these are based on APA scores, but based on overall cleanliness throughout the facility. The biggest outcome with this, their documented savings, they saved $500,000 per year, per year in using this approach, right? Why? Because the vendors can actually recommend services, and that's a more efficient, more optimal delivery of what they're looking to do here. So in summary here, the reason why we use benchmarks, the reason why we talked about all this here is that we need to be able to get what we paid for and being able to prove it. That's the key. Using the benchmarks, whether it's in the Europe reports that we have, whether it's in the North America report within Asia or India, whatever geographic region you're looking at, or any type of benchmark report, the goal of why we have those is to help us understand the value we're getting and to be able to look to our current services providers, whether in-house or outsourced, to justify the value that we're getting out of the contract and show that or prove that to our stakeholders. So if you'd like a copy of today's slides, be sure to drop me an email, jake.smithwick@uncc.edu, or if you have any other questions. But at this point in time, we'll go ahead and see if we have any questions from our audience. I'll keep an eye on the chat box here and see if you do have any questions, be sure to drop those in. Give it just another few seconds here. Okay. Well, folks, I don't see any questions coming through here. Again, if you do have questions, be sure to email me, jake.smithwick@uncc.edu. Thank you so much on behalf of IFMA for being here today. We encourage you to review the different benchmarks, and we sincerely appreciate your time. Take care, everybody. Stay safe, and we'll talk soon. Thanks. Bye.